Hi guys, welcome to another edition of All Things Football. Today we're going to be talking about Newcastle United, and I am joined by the man who works for Athletic UK. His name is Chris Waugh, and he covers Newcastle United. So someone that knows the club pretty well, Steve Bruce, pretty well. So let's get into it. Welcome to our show.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Hello, everyone out there.
So, Chris, if we can get into it, our call today is probably not going to be too long, but there's a lot to talk about with regards to Newcastle United. Recently, it was the international break, but just before that, there was the game against Brighton, and Newcastle lost quite badly. It was deemed a six-pointer, and they really fell quite short in terms of their performance. So a lot of the fans thought that would be the end of Steve Bruce. But it's shown that it's actually not been the end of Steve Bruce as Newcastle United manager. Why do you think he still remains?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, as you say, a lot of fans thought it was going to be the end. Actually, George Cock, my colleague, and I wrote a piece. George was there, and we wrote a piece together and basically said that it felt like the end, and it really did. Everything that went on, the manner of the defeat, the way that Bruce spoke after the game. Some of the players, my understanding, thought at least initially that he had been sacked, and some of them were maybe surprised that he hadn't been. And I don't think Bruce himself would have been surprised if it did happen. So if that was any other club, I think that the manager would have been sacked because of that result alone. But certainly given the cumulative effect of what's happened over the last few months, and probably would have been gone long before. But Mike Ashley's Newcastle is a strange and unconventional club as it is. But also this season, I mean, they tend to like to stick with managers as much as possible. And they were very reluctant when they sacked Steve McLaren in similar circumstances in 2015-16. And the difference then was that Rafa Benitez had offered himself through intermediaries to take over, so there was an alternative there. And also Newcastle were actually in the bottom three, whereas the difference at this moment in time is, as bad as their form has been, 2 wins in 20 in all competitions, 2 wins in 18 in the league. They remain fourth bottom. Fulham remain below them. They also have a game in hand, albeit away at Liverpool. And so for Newcastle's hierarchy this season, 17th place is enough because Mike Ashley didn't think he was going to be here. He didn't want to still be here. He tried to negotiate it. Well, he has negotiated an exit in terms of a £305 million transaction to sell the club to Amanda Staveley-fronted Saudi heavily funded takeover. But unfortunately, the Premier League has not passed that yet, and the saga drags on. Newcastle are currently have taken the Premier League to arbitration to try and change terms of basically the way that the owners and directors test, which is the Premier League's own internal test, is used essentially, and how it's enforced to try and get the takeover to happen. At the moment, that hasn't happened, and so Mike Ashley is here several months after he thought he was going to be. So for him, it was just ticking along to try and make sure Newcastle remained in the Premier League this year. At the moment, they're hurtling towards the Championship, but they're still not in the bottom three. And Steve Bruce also has a significant payoff clause in his contract. So while he has a relatively low basic wage of about £1 million a year, relative, I mean by Premier League coach standards, I don't mean relative by normal standards, he has a sort of punitive clause which is in excess of £4 million if Newcastle decide to sack him at the moment, and there is a reluctance to do that. So for all of those factors, and I suppose another one as well is that, as I mentioned before, Rafa Benitez came in to replace Steve McLaren in 2016 with 10 games remaining in 2008-9. When Newcastle went down, Alan Shearer was brought in with 8 games to go. Joe Kinnear had been ill, and Chris Hughton had been in temporary charge, and also Alan Shearer failed to keep Newcastle in the Premier League. But I see that personally as a selective recollection of history, because I don't think that it did play out quite as plainly as that. And I think that's a naive way of looking at how things were. Certainly in 2016, there was an upturn in form, albeit a belated one. If Benitez had come in 2 games sooner, Newcastle probably would have survived. Also, they ended up going down with momentum, if that's possible. They changed it. They changed the environment. That everyone seemed to be pushing in the right direction. Final home game of the season against Spurs felt like Newcastle had won a cup, never mind just being relegated. So whereas at the moment, all of the mood is negative, it feels downward. Internally, there's a lot of issues going on as well with the players. And so it's a very, very difficult question to answer. But Mike Ashley defies logic, and once again, he seems to be doing just that.
You mentioned the takeover that could possibly, drag on for another 3 months, 6 months, a year, could never happen, depending on what happens in the arbitration. But have you heard anything recently regarding that?
Well, it's a very complicated situation in terms of, so it is currently at arbitration. That proceedings are just about to begin, as my understanding. They were delayed actually because of Newcastle. They could have happened sooner, so it was interesting because we don't hear from Mike Ashley and from the Newcastle hierarchy very often, but we have heard from them 3 times regarding the prospective takeover since September. Most recently, we heard from them last month, confirming that the club had appealed against one of the. This is very complicated, so I apologise in advance, but I'll try and put it in as much layman's terms as possible, and to try and dilute as much information out of it as possible. But essentially, the way that arbitration works is that there is a 3-person panel of expert lawyers, one of whom is proposed by Newcastle United as the member club, one of whom is proposed by the Premier League, and then a third arbiter who is proposed collectively. And they agreed on a collective on the third person, who was going to be the chair. But then Newcastle subsequently found out that the chair had previously advised the Premier League on certain changes to the owners and directors test that had made in 2017. And so Newcastle tried to get him removed, failed, and then decided to take the situation to the High Court in England to try and get the person removed as the third arbiter. So that's dragged on for months. That was in October. They took them to the High Court. Eventually that got resolved in March. They lost the case, so the arbiter remains on the panel. What Newcastle did get was the ability to release that information publicly. They also wanted the full arbitration to be held publicly, but that's not going to happen. And the arbitration itself, I think there's a slight misconception that some people think that if Newcastle were to win the arbitration, the takeover would automatically happen. That isn't necessarily the case. The arbitration is to decide whether the prospective owners of Newcastle United, or 80% of the prospective owners of Newcastle United, the Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund, whether they are a separate entity to the Saudi Arabian state, or whether they are in fact de facto the Saudi Arabian state, and therefore the Saudi Arabian state have to be put through the Premier League's owners and directors test. The Premier League have never actually rejected the takeover. Newcastle are very interested in the first statement they released, used the term Premier League rejected the takeover, and I think that was deliberately provocative to make it seem like they had done. But the Premier League insists they've never actually rejected it. It got stuck at this point of the actual owners and directors test, where the Premier League were asking for more information and saying that they saw the Saudi state as essentially a shadow director, that they had to go through it. The PIF denied that and didn't believe that to be the case, and so it never progressed beyond that point, and it basically got stuck in a logjam. We are essentially still there where we were last June, only now we are at the point of arbitration in theory going to decide if and when that is the case. That could take a matter of weeks. It could take months. Some people believe it could even take years. I certainly don't think I don't think it's likely before the end of the season. I can't say that for certain, but I don't think it is. And then the issue becomes with that is, if Newcastle United are no longer a Premier League club, it's not that there wouldn't be the same interest in the takeover. My understanding is that there still would be, although it would become more difficult in that sense. And also there would have to be a renegotiation in price. It would knock probably at least £100 million off that 305 million. You're probably talking less than 150 million. It's not only whether the prospective buyers would want to still pay that if it's a championship club and how much would be willing to pay, it's how much Mike Ashley would be willing to accept in that situation. For years, he's shown no inclination to accept less than the price that he has wanted previously. And also, when the last 2 times Newcastle have gone into the Championship, he's ended up almost putting more money back in to make sure they come back in the Premier League. Part of his asking price, part of the 305 million, is 111 million pounds of interest-free loans he still has into the club. So essentially, if you take into account inflation, the price that Mike Ashley paid plus the loans, he essentially is making very little profit in terms of direct profit from the deal. Now, you can argue, but the club hasn't moved on in that time, and in some ways it's gone backwards. So should he be making any profit at all? Should he just accept any price? But this is Mike Ashley, and he wants almost the perfect business deal, and he thought he had it. He still thinks he has it, and he would still like it to go through. But at this moment in time, the very long answer, I apologise to your question about the takeover, is that we are basically where we were last June and no further forward from it.
As a fan, I think it's very frustrating, and it would be typical Newcastle for the takeover to potentially have the green light, so to speak, but then for Newcastle to be relegated, and basically that dream that we had to fall away because of Mike Ashley and his negligence of the club. So I think it's a very frustrating time as a fan, because we had that dream and it was almost a reality, and now we're facing possible relegation. So yeah, it's typical Newcastle, never black and white. But on to what's also happened since the last game. There's been some news with regards to players signing new contracts or being offered new contracts. Do you have any information regarding that? I think Dwight Gale was offered a 3-year contract. Fabian Schär has been rumored to have his clause activated in terms of another year. Do you have any news regarding that?
Well, my colleague on The Athletic, David Ornstein, wrote in his Monday column this week that Dwight Gale has been offered a new 3-year contract, which is a strange one in many ways, given that he isn't playing at the moment. When Newcastle lost 3-0 at Brighton, he was not brought on, even when Newcastle needed a goal. Neither him nor Andy Carroll, the strikers on the bench, were brought on. He has only started 2 games all season. Steve Bruce has been adamant that he's always rated him and that he tried to sign him several times previously, yet has seemed reluctant to play him. But from Newcastle's point of view, I think there's a lot of pragmatism towards it. I wrote a column on this, essentially looking at it the other day, and basically this summer, if Newcastle don't keep Dwight Gale to a new contract, then to replace Dwight Gale, even with the sort of like-for-like, fairly average Premier League striker, you'd be talking 10 to 15 million pounds, if not more. They also would have they would lose Dwight Gale for free, so they wouldn't be able to sell him in the future, as they maybe can do now with this contract. And Newcastle have been affected financially by the pandemic, as so many clubs have. They don't have the disposable income that maybe they did previously. And so money is going to be tight this summer. And if they can avoid having to spend money in that area so that they can prioritise different areas, then they'll look to do that. And from Gale's point of view, I think that he looks at it as the offers that he maybe thought were going to be there pre-pandemic. Also for him, they're not necessarily there as much anymore, and he can take this contract, albeit on a reduced salary, and then potentially still look for an exit as well. And it may work out best for all parties in that sense, but it gives them security in the meantime. As for Fabian Schär, he has my understanding is there is a clause in his contract which can be extended for another year. I expect that to be enacted unless his injury turns out to be worse than first feared, although he is said to be making good recovery. So I think that his contract will be extended. Federico Fernandez, his contract's up. Newcastle are still negotiating with him. Steve Bruce is keen to keep him on, but I think similar to Gale, it's worth keep. I think Federico Fernandez has been one of Newcastle's most consistent players over the last 2 years anyway, before COVID struck, and he's had some injuries since. Jacob Murphy's an interesting one because he hasn't featured that much. He's in the final year of his contract. Newcastle would certainly like to extend to try and retain value. Whether Jacob Murphy wants to do that, I'm not 100% sure. So that one's a bit more up in the air. And then there's Andy Carroll as well. And if you'd asked me a few weeks ago, I'd have said I think there's very little chance of Andy Carroll staying on. But similar to the sort of Dwight Gale situation, given the uncertainty around the club, I think that there is a reasonable chance that certainly not beyond the realms of possibility that Andy Carroll could maybe sign another contract on a similar sort of pay-as-you-play deal as he's got at the moment.
Interesting. So in terms of the team news, we've got a big game coming up against Tottenham Hotspurs on Sunday. Callum Wilson and Allan Saint-Maximin, they've both been training. Do you think they'll be in line to start the game, or is it more a case of them being, starting from the bench?
Well, it'll be very interesting to hear from Steve Bruce at his pre-match press conference tomorrow. Certainly, I expect them to be in and around there and pushing for it. Certainly, Callum Wilson, both of them have been training, and Wilson has been making very good progress. It's interesting on Wilson because there's been sort of mixed reports from behind the scenes where some said that he was going to be out for longer than the initial 8-week layoff. This will be just slightly shorter than the initial 8-week layoff. So he has made good progress. Steve Bruce for weeks had basically said, oh, well, when we get our best players back, when we get our front three back, we'll be all right. And it was interesting because in the aftermath of the Brighton game, he seemed to downplay it a little bit and said, look, Callum Wilson won't have played in a couple of months. Allan Saint-Maximin have been out for several weeks. We can't expect too much of them too soon. And that it was interesting to hear him say that. And he raised a point there. But equally, if either or both are available, then I think that they will be in the team. I think Callum Wilson in particular, just because Newcastle desperately need that goal scorer. Saint-Maximin, they may be a little bit more cautious with, because he has had a lot of similar injuries to the one he's had, the more muscular ones. Plus, he did have COVID, which Newcastle think that a lot of the muscular injuries they've had since have been because of the effects of COVID as well, and sort of weakening the body. So I think that there's a reasonable chance. I think that one or both will be in the squad at the very least, and potentially Wilson could be in the starting lineup. There's an outside chance that Saint-Maximin could be, but I think there's a reasonable chance Wilson could, if he's come through this week when he's trying to have a behind closed door 90-minute performance to see how he can get through with like an intra-squad friendly, essentially.
And then speaking of injuries, Isaac Hayden was injured in that game against Brighton. Do you see it? When the injury happened, Jeff Hendrick came on, and he's not very popular amongst Newcastle fans at the moment because his performances haven't really merited him being in the starting lineup, or at least making an appearance. Do you think the Longstaff stand a chance in terms of starting, or is it going to be Jeff Hendrick?
I mean, Isaac Hayden, that was another blow for Newcastle. Yeah, so he's out for the rest of the season. Hoping to be back for pre-season. It wasn't as bad as first feared, but still he's out for the remaining 9 games. It was Jeff Hendrick who came on, which was I find a lot of Newcastle fans find frustrating. I think even beyond it being a midfielder, I think a lot of Newcastle fans would have liked to have seen a striker by that stage as well, or just something to change the way that Newcastle were playing. I don't think it's cut and dry that it will be Jeff Hendrick who comes into the team. My understanding is that Newcastle have certainly at least discussed potentially changing system, personnel during the course of this week. I do expect to see changes beyond just injury-enforced ones for Sunday. I do think we'll see a little bit of it. Whether the shape changes, I'm still not sure, but I do think that we'll see some changes in personnel. That would bring the Longstaffs back into contention. Matty Longstaff hasn't even been in the squad for weeks. I think that it's not beyond the realms of possibility that one of those two could come in. Or equally, what I would quite like to see is a sort of reshaped side to almost a 4-2-3-1 with maybe Willock and somebody else sitting. Personally, maybe I wouldn't have Shelvey in, but I would be surprised if Shelvey doesn't come out of the team. Then if Saint-Maximin and Wilson are fit, have Saint-Maximin, Wilson, Almiron and Fraser all in like a front four. Fraser scored 2 and 2 for Scotland, and it'll be interesting to actually see. I think last summer, I remember writing a piece of The Athletic, and a lot of people were sort of saying, love to see a 4-2-3-1 with those 4 up front. And we've never actually seen that. That's not been the case all season. And so Isaac Hayden's injury is disappointing, but it maybe opens up the opportunity for things like that. So I don't think it's beyond the realms of possibility that the Longstaffs will come back in, but equally, or one of the Longstaffs will come back in. But equally, if they do, it sort of shows as well a lot of the confusion that there's been, because they've barely been seen for 2 or 3 months. And then suddenly, when Newcastle need them most, when they're in a real relegation scrap, can't really afford to lose games, need to win them, suddenly they're called back in from the cold. It sort of shows the disharmony and confusion that's around the club as well.
Totally agree. So how do you see that game going? Because like you mentioned that there could be a possible switch in formation, which I think would be a good thing. But how do you see that game going? Because early in the season, it ended 1-1 at the new White Hart Lane Stadium. But basically, how do you see that game going, given that our form has obviously been very bad, 2 wins from 20? How do you see that game going? Do you expect things to continue in that way, or do you see somehow a surprise performance from the squad?
Well, you mentioned the 1-1 draw away from home at Spurs. I mean, Newcastle were extremely fortunate. They relied on Carl Darlow making a string of wonderful saves. Spurs missing lots of chances, and then they got a very fortunate penalty towards the end of the game, which, if it would not be awarded now, because they've ended up changing the handball rules subsequently. And that was at a point, though, when Newcastle were somehow still getting results. And it happened a lot of last season where performances sort of didn't necessarily match up with results. But while that happens, as you're getting the results, then you sort of take them. On Sunday, Spurs aren't in brilliant form themselves. They've been very up and down. They've had a lot of internationals away. But you look at it, and there's no game that you can actually say with any confidence Newcastle will go and win that. I'd say that they should and they need to, but they're on. I look at the final 9 matches, and even against the likes of Sheffield United and Fulham, Newcastle couldn't beat Sheffield United away in January. They couldn't beat West Brom. They lost to Brighton. They lost to Crystal Palace, they lost to Leeds. So there's not one team I can say to you that I'm confident, given that they've only won 2 and 20, that they'll go and win. So I'm certainly not going to predict a victory. A draw wouldn't surprise me. I don't think there'll be that many goals in it, or if there will, I think they'll be for Spurs. But I don't think there'll be that many goals in it. I think Jose Mourinho will probably relish this game and see it as a real opportunity for Spurs to come to a Newcastle team. A Newcastle team have got no confidence whatsoever, no form whatsoever. But I've just got a sneaking suspicion that it'll be tight and maybe decided by 1 goal. So I'm gonna go for 1-1. And be a little, I was going to say positive. It's not really positive to say Newcastle draw because they need to win. But given the negativity, it wouldn't be, I suppose, the worst possible result. But at some point, they need to start winning games. So I'm going to predict 1-1, but that's me being pretty optimistic at the same time.
Let's hope for that, because I think, most fans are predicting a loss. So I think a draw, we'd take it. But the fact that Fulham play immediately after our game, knowing our result, that will also be a bit of a tricky situation, because do we accept the draw if it's there for the taking, or do we actually really push for the 3 points, given that if we don't win, Fulham could overtake us, and that would put us in the bottom 3. So it's going to be tough.
That is the difficult psychology, but Newcastle sort of got caught up in this, or Bruce did a few weeks ago when Newcastle played West Brom away, and my opinion was they should have gone there to try to win, because if you can't go to West Brom and try to win, who are you going to go against and try and win? And I think in the immediate aftermath, he saw that as a positive sort of draw. Newcastle hadn't lost to West Brom, which basically almost relegated West Brom. But then Fulham immediately afterwards went and won at Liverpool, and then suddenly you're actually are 2 points worse off come the end of the day. And so I just don't think Newcastle can afford to think about Fulham. They have to win themselves. If I flip it around a little bit, I was on a Fulham podcast last week, and I was asked about whether I think Newcastle survive, and I actually said, at the moment, I think it's more about what Fulham do than what Newcastle do, because as long as Fulham don't get ahead of Newcastle, then I think that Steve Bruce will probably remain in charge. But if Fulham can leapfrog Newcastle in the course of the next few weeks, maybe that will force a change in focus minds. But at the moment, they are sort of heading one way, and they're almost relying on the fact that Fulham haven't picked up enough points to get beyond them is to almost keep them in the Premier League at the moment. And that's unsustainable. Eventually, you have to win your own games. 29 points is not enough. You need another 10 easily. So that's the frustration with Newcastle, because they had started the season so well, and then they've just absolutely nosedived. Just one team always cliche, but one team always seems to do that each year, and it's been Newcastle United this year.
You basically touched on my last question, which was, should Newcastle not win against Spurs, or in fact, should they lose against Spurs? Do you think that would then be the end of Steve Bruce, or is it the fact that there's only going to be 7 or 8 games left, and they might, feel that it's a bit too late? But what do you think? Should they lose against Spurs, what would happen?
It's a good question. I think part of it will depend on the manner of the defeat. If they were to lose 3 or 4-0, that will be successive sort of hammerings, and in which case I think that may have a bearing. But if it's a sort of tight defeat, and maybe if they're unlucky, then that may help save Steve Bruce. But also I think it depends on what Fulham do. If Fulham were to lose immediately afterwards and Newcastle are still outside the relegation zone, then I don't think there will be a change. It almost seems in a perverse sort of way that all the criticism of Bruce and all of the desire from a large proportion of the fan base, if not the majority, and if not all of the fan base, want rid of him now, that's almost emboldened the hierarchy and to stick by him in a perverse sort of way, as if that's bolstering them. It's a very weird sort of way of looking at it. But there's been some noises emanating even from within the ground that even if they're going to the relegation zone, and even if they end up getting relegated, they will stick with Steve Bruce. My personal take on that would be that it's all well and good saying that now, but if you actually fall into the bottom 3, if Newcastle say to lose 3-0 on Sunday and then Fulham win, then I think that focuses minds, and I think that mindsets would then potentially change, and particularly if a couple of managers start presenting themselves going forward, or maybe if they decide that Graham Jones, the assistant they brought in January, could potentially see them through until the end of the season. I think that so there's numerous different factors there, and trying to second guess Mike Ashley is close to impossible. As I say, as I started this conversation with, if it had been any other Premier League club or any other club in just about any other division, Steve Bruce I don't think would be in charge, and wouldn't have been in charge for a long while. And if fans had been inside St James's Park, I don't think he would have been there for a long while either. But they can almost cushion themselves from that and sort of shield themselves from it because they can just say it's social media noise. So it's a non-answer, I'm afraid. But I just trying to second guess Mike Ashley is absolutely futile. And unfortunately, who knows? It would not surprise me if Steve Bruce was here still at the end of the season, regardless of what happens. But equally, if Newcastle were to get hammered on Sunday and then Fulham win, then it would not surprise me either if this time next week Newcastle were looking for another manager.
I sincerely, well, I'm not hoping for a defeat, but I sincerely hope that Steve Bruce's days are numbered. But Chris, I want to say thank you for joining us today. Your insight has been really brilliant, and I'm sure fans will enjoy that. But yeah, if for the fans out there, please don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel. But Chris, thanks again, and all the best to you.
Thank you very much. All the best to everyone out there.